Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with a discussion about Lords of the End Times for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Grave Assembly has just done a stream on how the endgame scenarios are going to work, and on Archaon, the Ever-Chosen, how his campaign is going to be changed with the release of the DLC. There's going to be an endgame scenario for Archaon. Another one is going to be the Vermintide for the Skaven, and it is going to be led by Screech Vermin King. And the third one is, of course, going to be related to Nagash. Makes sense. Now, this is the current live version of the game, but I'm just using it to show it off as a contrast to talk about, like, kind of the changes that they're going to make. Okay, so first and foremost, each of the end game scenarios has devastation associated with it. So you have visual devastation, the way the map looks, new battle scenarios as well, or how the maps will look based on devastation in a particular province. But on top of that, you do have a gameplay aspect with devastation. So you're going to have Chaotic Wasteland, you're going to have Undead Wasteland, which is something Nagash is going to do, and then Skaven Wasteland. And when you're talking about Wasteland, you're talking about uninhabitable climate, you're talking about significant consequences for those territories being razed, and maybe territories being unable to be reclaimed, because if you defeat an endgame scenario, you've won the campaign. You can set these scenarios to spawn whenever you want, and you might even deal with all of them at the same time. And I think that would be very appropriate because that's exactly what happened in the end times. But let's talk about how these scenarios are going to work based on what Grave Assembly has revealed. They showed off with Chaos 1, they showed off a campaign turn 20 as Karl Franz, so not really a whole lot of territory. And what they mentioned is that the Chaos armies, at the very least, will spawn in proximity to your empire. Now, whether or not this means proximity to your capital or proximity to your borders, that's something I'm curious about. Because you could build a massive empire in a campaign, and if they spawn in the middle of the empire, that would not be great. But based on how they described it, I would imagine it's close enough, but not quite within the borders of your empire. So there's a bit of distance between you and the Chaos factions. And Archaon is going to spawn in a central position in relation to that. So there's going to be armies to the south, armies to the north. They're going to be led by legendary lords, so there's going to be Kolic, there's going to be Be'lakor, there's going to be all kinds of Chaos factions, Chaos legendary lords to deal with. And the key thing about how this is going to work is that Archaon's army in the endgame scenario for Chaos is practically invincible. So they have 100% ward save when they spawn, and usually ward save is capped at like 40% in terms of effect, but that's not going to apply to Archaon's army. So it's basically an army you cannot defeat, or anyone can defeat. It begs the question of auto-resolve and all that kind of stuff. Maybe you just can't achieve that. Then again, Archaon does have a pretty good auto-resolve situation, so it would take significant force concentration to defeat him. And even if you do defeat him on the campaign map, that doesn't mean it's the end of it, because you still have the final battle to fight Archaon. And I imagine that's going to be the case in every endgame scenario where you defeat a faction or you defeat an endgame scenario on the campaign map, and then you have a final battle. Or in the case of Nagash, the way you end him is his scenario starts, and then 20 turns after that, you get the final battle available to you. But you're kind of in a rush to deal with Nagash, because if you take too long, he's just going to destroy parts of the world. And also, depending on how well you've done up until that point, it's going to be either more or less difficult to deal with him. I'm curious about the situation for Warriors of Chaos, because when you look at like Archaon's army having ward save, does that mean that if we just somehow defeat Archaon's army, even if it has a high level of ward save, we still have to deal with his army in the final battle with a significant level of ward save there? That is the question. It is also the question of how other Chaos factions are going to be affected by this endgame crisis, because they did show how it works for Archaon. You become the endgame, but one of the things I would like to mention is that with Norska and Warhammer 1, if you were playing Norska and Warhammer 1, you could either join Archaon or fight against him in that endgame scenario. I think that's a choice that you should be given as a cast faction. So there's things that we would like to know with, in relation to that. But yeah, you get those armies, and the way they even have it in the tooltip for this endgame scenario is that it spawns, it's very hard initially, but then the difficulty curve of the endgame crisis is easy because he just spawns a bunch of armies. If those armies are defeated even once in battle, they get eliminated. And every single army and those dark fortresses that Archaon has, their removal permanently weakens him. So it's something that technically gets easier. And in all of these scenarios, any faction that's fighting against that endgame crisis, and we did see that they do declare war on a whole bunch of factions, like Archaon declared war on Skaven as well, not just like dwarves and Empire and all that. Which I suppose, given that Skaven and Cast don't necessarily get along as well as you might think, then that makes sense. But every faction gets a diplomatic benefit. So you're not just looking at the situation where you're fighting Archaon on your own, you're fighting Archaon alongside many other factions around the world, because there's going to be armies that are hostile to a lot of different people in a campaign. So that's the Chaos one. As for Archaon himself, the big changes that exist in his campaign, well, first off, the way Confederation works with Chaos is different. So you can confederate any legendary lord of Chaos. So you're looking at Warriors of Chaos and you're looking at demonic faction. So you can get Tamarkan, you can get the Kala, you can get Scarbrand, you can get Be'lakor, all that. The way it functions is different. Now, currently in the game, the way you confederate Warriors of Chaos faction playing as either Archaon or Be'lakor is you reduce them to their last element and then you have a forced confederation on them. The way it will work is it will be based on the destruction of their last army, and then you get the choice whether or not you confederate them. But their territory will be given to a vassal faction, so a vassal of Khorne, vassal of Nurgle. It does beg the question of undivided factions, you know, like Kholek and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it will be given to vassals in a campaign. On top of that, if a faction gets eliminated, so for instance, you have the situation where in a campaign both Kholek and Tamarkan are fighting each other. If these factions get eliminated, you still get the choice to confederate. So basically they've made the Recruit Defeat Legendary Lords mod kind of like standard gameplay for Archaon. Now, of course, it will depend on how things work out, but generally you can expect either Kholek or Tamarkan to be eliminated. You can expect maybe the Kala to be eliminated, though that's kind of touch and go. Though Josh did show in his stream that he did gain the Kala, so I imagine she just got eliminated by Gelt and Cafe, and that situation makes sense. Valk has a big question mark because sometimes she gets eliminated, sometimes she does very well. Out of cast factions, it's generally speaking Be'lakor, Valkia, and Sigvald that tend to do very well. Then you have the discussion of Galatkin. I imagine Galatkin will have a good amount of survivability. And also, one can't help but wonder what's going to happen with Daniel. But given the proximity to him, you probably will just want to wipe him out and then confederate him if you can. And if you can't, well, it's no great loss. I think most people will agree that. So that's the first thing with regards to Archaon, the confederation change. On top of that, they showed in terms of warband upgrades that you can get Skull Reapers and Wrathmongers in terms of the warband upgrades, even as Archaon. So that is definitely a change. I guess it makes sense for, Archaon to have the entire cast roster, but it's quite ridiculous. So you'll have a lot of heroes, a lot of units, a lot of legendary lords available to you. One thing to mention about that is that you can only gain the heroes of Tamarkan that he has available at the moment. You can't spawn new ones. Maybe you should just get all the heroes, but really those legendary heroes are not so relevant outside of like Tamarkan's unique campaign mechanics associated with them. Sure, it's nice to have the heroes, but it's also like the main strength of those heroes, except Kask, really, is really come down to the fact that they get units and various abilities on the campaign map battle. So, and that's exclusive to Tamarkan. And in terms of the end game event for Archaon, you get a choice. You can either continue playing the campaign normally, or you can become, be the Lord of the End Times. If you become the Lord of the End Times, here's what happens: you and your vassals no longer can no longer occupy territory. You can either raise it or sack it. And your goal is actually to destroy the empire and then devastate a bunch of provinces. The way devastation works is that if half the regions in a province are destroyed, razed to the ground, then the climate will change for that province and basically make it uninhabitable. I am really wondering if we have some way of countering that. If we're playing, like, maybe if we deal with an endgame event, we can finally reclaim the territory. It's also especially relevant when you're talking about vampire counts in Nagash, because those factions inherently have the ability of putting up undead wasteland. Not sure about the Skaven, but it is an interesting decision to have, like, the climate change effect, but having some way of countering it would be great. No, I guess we'll have to see on that. Maybe it's not so relevant, again, considering we're talking about in-game events. I think it's more relevant to talk about the vampire counts and to talk about Nagash's situation with respect to that. So that's with Archaon. That's how he's going to work. You have that decision. Again, questions about, like, different legendary lords, including Warriors of Chaos, like, how is Glotkin's campaign going to tie into all of that, because he did fight side by side with Archaon, so different discussions on that subject. Also, if you're playing Archaon, I think one of the things that you should get, this is just my perspective, we know there's going to be a final quest battle. Well, what if you would have the reverse of that, where you're playing Archaon and everyone's trying to march against you in a last-ditch effort to stop you, and winning that wins you the campaign. Now, as for the Skaven, the Vermintide, it's going to be Crix Vermin King, and the way the Skaven work, whereas Archaon is about destroying territory and having a couple of dark fortresses that you need to deal with, the Skaven one is they hold a bunch of territory and can expand it. The function of that is they have special Vermintide undercities, and these undercities, they do have different tiers, I guess, and they spawn Vermintide armies. So the Skaven may function more along the lines of a regular faction, though, of course, all of the factions of the Skaven united under one banner. And you can actually prevent them from expanding, because there is a chance for those undercities to expand, and one of your main goals in a campaign probably is going to be to stop the expansion of territory. And that's just the start of the Skaven one. It seems the Skaven one is more about escalation, continuous escalation, so we don't exactly know what the Skaven are aiming for and how you'll be able to stop them, because I imagine it's not just remove all their territory, that's just slowing them down. What the Skaven might be doing is Doom Spheres, because there is a mention in the tooltip of, like, Doom Spheres detonated, so that's maybe what the Skaven are looking for. Accumulate a lot of those undercities and then detonate Doom Spheres to make the territory uninhabitable, and then have Skaven wasteland climate being established across the world. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised they decided to go with Screech as opposed to Fanquil, because it was Fanquil that was leading the Skaven in the end times. And this obviously does beg the question of what happens when you are playing a Skaven faction. Can you become the endgame? What was mentioned is that you will not be fighting the endgame of your own faction. I think that's the case, so maybe that's the answer to what happens to cash factions. You're just not going to fight it. I think you should have the option of fighting Archaon, and as this game one's kind of more difficult to say on that, but still, on how that's going to play out. Maybe you do become the Vermintide and start detonating things around the world. That would be pretty awesome for all Skaven campaigns, or at least Fanquil in that kind of situation. Or maybe the endgame, the Skaven endgame doesn't trigger in a Skaven campaign. Then we have the Nagash one. So, and keep in mind, all of these endgame scenarios do have events that occur before they start. So they just showed off with like the Skaven and Archaon event in game scenarios, though the scenarios just triggering, but there's also build up various events that happen. When Nagash, they showed, for instance, that before the Nagash endgame crisis starts, sometime before that, all the books in Nagash get removed on the campaign map. Big question on how that's going to affect any campaign that deals with the books in Nagash. But all the books in Nagash get removed, and all of the Mortarch armies and factions also get removed to, of course, join Nagash. And then when the Nagash endgame crisis spawns, you get a bunch of undead armies to deal with, united, like the Mortarch armies, all those faction leaders, and you have to deal with them. And all those armies, all the territory, all the Mortarchs themselves are giving Nagash power. So Nagash can get significantly a very high power level in a campaign. And you have 20 turns as he starts moving the Black Pyramid from the Grey Mortis Delta to Nagashazar. 20 turns. When he moves it there, his power level, this is what Mitch was mentioning in the stream, his power level gets locked. So you have 20 turns to reduce the power level that his armies do have in order to make things easier in the final battle. Once the Black Pyramid is moved in Nagashazar, you can fight the final quest battle against Nagash to defeat him. That battle will be more or less difficult. Will either be more difficult or easier, depending on the power level Nagash has. So I guess that's not necessarily going to affect Nagash's army. It's going to affect his personal power level. So you can either deal with an extremely powerful Nagash in that final battle, or a far less powerful one. So that's how you stop Nagash. And you don't have to make your way to Nagashazar yourself, thankfully. I'm glad for that, because it's a really crappy location to actually navigate towards. Instead, and you can't attack the Black Pyramid or Nagashazar while the Black Pyramid is moving. But once it's moved there, you can teleport there and find Nagash and defeat him. And that's going to be the Nagash endgame event. So those are the endgame scenarios that Creative Assembly has talked about. Of course, plenty of questions with regards to how, Vampire Counts factions, Vampire Coast factions, Archaon, Manfred especially, and Luther Harkon will be affected by, say, the Nagash crisis. How will Cast factions, how will Skaven factions be affected by that? They also showed off the victory conditions for Archaon, for instance, with the short campaign victory condition. You do gain a benefit of being able to recruit more Swords of Chaos, Regiments of Renown, in a campaign and get them earlier, so the cooldown timer on recruiting them, so you'll have a bunch of Chaos Knights, Regiments of Renown in that situation. If you are playing Archaon and complete his short campaign victory. Beyond that, in terms of the long campaign victory, the long campaign is destroy the Empire, devastate 8 provinces. Though keep in mind, this is not the definitive version. There's a bunch of changes that they are still making, because we're talking about things 1 month away, so you're looking at the final QA testing, final changes that they're implementing in Lords of the End Times. But what I did notice as Josh was hovering over the game, over things in the long campaign menu, is that you get Lord and Hero rank plus 10 faction-wide if you achieve a long campaign victory as Archaon. Of course, domination victory, having to destroy the entire world, probably something of a hassle. But regardless, that's what Creative Assembly is going to do with these endgame crises. I imagine that the performance on the campaign map, especially with the Skaven, because it seems the Skaven will have tons of armies spread around the world. Like they showed armies in Skaven Blight, just for reference purposes. So There were armies spawning in Skaven Blight, there were armies spawning Carrick Apex, so you had Quick over there. Then you had Hellpit, and then you had Lustria, and there were like 4-5 armies per each of those provinces, for instance. And that's obviously not all there is. So there's going to be probably dozens of armies roaming around the campaign map and these endgame scenarios. And yeah, I imagine the turn timer is going to be something interesting in that situation. On the flip side, lots of armies, lots of foes to deal with, a global alliance against those factions. I'm really curious to see how things play out. If you enable all 3 of them, I think that's what I'm going to do in one of my campaigns. You know, play maybe as Hadi and trigger all of them, and then deal with all of them at the same time. Probably crazy to do so, and certainly not recommended as per what Creative Assembly has stated, but I wonder if they fight each other too. They should, really, so that could create a very interesting situation in a campaign. On top of that, yeah, there's been some changes to Warband recruitment. Sigvald is now Slaanesh, which makes him infinitely less useful, honestly. Like, I get it, you know, people wanted him to be Slaanesh. To be fair, Sigvald was kind of irrelevant, even as Undivided, because if you're playing Undivided, you're just far, far better off playing Archaon or Be'lakor. And it's a similar issue with, you know, Kolic being affected by it. Like, yeah, Kolic can be strong individually, but he can't confederate other Legendary Lords, whereas Archaon and Be'lakor can. So that is a fairly substantial change. And probably changes to Archaon's quest battles as well. You do need to acquire the quest items. I'm not sure if the quest items themselves have been changed in any way, shape, or form. But yeah, you still probably have quest battles to gain and get those items for your campaign victory condition. One of the big things I would really like to see with Warriors of Chaos is a change to a research tree, but I guess we'll have to find out what they have and haven't implemented for Warriors of Chaos. And that would be all, boys and girls. Costin here, signing out. Stay tuned for more.